Simone singing in Hebrew, the land of milk and honey. And welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. In January of this year, New York Times columnist Michelle Alexander wrote an op-ed piece interestingly entitled, "Time to Break the Silence on Palestine." As a sociologist and criminologist, I'm well familiar with her classic work, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Many consider it to be the Bible for the movement to radically transform our criminal justice system. I'm also familiar greatly admire and identify strongly with her other writings on criminal justice and her more recent work on spiritual progressive efforts to use the ideas of radical love to transform the system and our world. I was also aware that the piece appeared at about the same time as this year's Women's March was to happen, a march that had become fractured over serious allegations of anti-Semitism that had dogged some of the march's leaders for over a year, but which lately reached a crisis point. So it was with great eagerness and some trepidation that I read her January piece. In the article, Alexander starts out by seemingly equating Martin Luther King speaking out about the Vietnam War in 1967 and the need to do the same about Palestine today. To quote her, Martin Luther King Jr. courageously spoke out about the Vietnam War. We must do the same when it comes to this grave injustice of our time, Palestine. Later in the article, she cites Rabbi Brian Walt, one of our guests on the show today. He's spoken publicly about the reasons that he abandoned his faith in what he viewed as political Zionism. For him, liberal Zionism meant that he believed in the creation of a Jewish state that would be a desperately needed safe haven and cultural center for Jewish people around the world, a state that would reflect as well as honor the highest ideas and ideals of the Jewish tradition. He had grown up in South Africa in a family that shared those views and identified as a liberal Zionist until his experiences in the occupied territories forever changed him. During more than 20 visits to the West Bank and Gaza, he saw horrific human rights abuses, including Palestinian homes being bulldozed while people cried, children's toys strewn over one demolished site over another, and saw Palestinian lands being confiscated to make way for new illegal settlements subsidized by the Israeli government. He was forced to reckon with the reality that these demolitions, settlements, and acts of violent dispossession were not rogue moves, but fully supported and enabled by the Israeli military. For him, the turning point was witnessing legalized discrimination against Palestinians, including streets for Jews only, which he said was worse in some ways than what he had witnessed as a boy in South Africa. Alexander goes on to argue that the days when critiques of Zionism and the actions of the State of Israel can be written off as anti-Semitic are coming to an end. There seems to be increased understanding, she says, that criticism of the policies and practices of the Israeli government is not in itself anti-Semitic. And to further solidify her case, Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign is cited as leading by example, pledging allegiance to the fight against anti-Semitism while also demonstrating unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian people struggling to survive under Israeli occupation. A number of organizations and individuals, supporters of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, including Jewish Voice for Peace, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, the Pension Board of the United Methodist Church and the United Church of Christ, and sitting members of the Congress, Representative Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, were mentioned in the article supporting the BDS movement. No Israeli or Zionist positions were included. While the piece admits that we can't know for sure what King would do or think regarding Israel-Palestine today, it argues that the evidence regarding King's views on Israel is complicated and contradictory. Furthermore, though, the article agrees with the historian Robin D.G. Kelly, who concluded that if King had the opportunity to study the current situation in the same way he had studied Vietnam, quote unquote, his unequivocal opposition to violence, colonialism, racism, and militarism would have made him an incisive critic of Israel's current policies. As Rabbi Arthur Waskow of the Shalom Center and others have pointed out, Israeli-Palestinian issues have entered into the very fiber of U.S. politics and the very fiber of American Judaism. As a further example of what he's referring to, in a recent email to the leadership of Move On, Rabbi Waskow pointed to the pro-impeachment rallies scheduled for noon local time on Saturday, June 15th, were timed in such a way as to raise questions as to whether Move On was ignorant of the Jewish Shabbat practice or consciously chose not to involve religiously caring Jews. We are thrilled to have on the Radical Imagination today two of the leading visionaries and voices of progressive Jewry in this country and the world to help us discuss these issues and more. Rabbi Brian Walt was born in Cape Town, South Africa, during the apartheid era, is a human rights activist who is the founding executive director of Rabbis for Human Rights North America from 2003 to 2008, and is the Palestinian-Israeli Nonviolence Project Fellow at the Dorothy Cotton Institute. He has been a congregational rabbi for over 25 years, serving at Tikkun V'Or Synagogue in Ithaca, New York, since 2009. Our other guest today is Susannah Heschel, the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship is focused on Jewish and Christian interactions in Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries. She's the author of numerous books and articles, is a Guggenheim Fellow, and the recipient of numerous awards, including 4 honorary doctorates. She's been in the forefront of the Jewish feminist movement, writing about Judaism from a feminist perspective rather than discussing women from Judaism's point of view. And she's the daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the leading Jewish theologians and philosophers of the 20th century. Brief transparency for our audience. Susannah is a dear friend and the first person I reached out to get comments on Michelle Alexander's op-ed piece. And I've talked with Brian several times last summer about organizing a fundraiser for Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, and met him in person for the first time at the Freedom Seder with Rabbi Wasco and Reverend Barber just a couple of months ago. Susannah was the person who introduced me to her old dear friend, Brian. So, we are all friends here trying to grapple with some difficult issues that can impact on progressive politics as a movement, its possible influence on American politics inside and outside the Democratic Party, and its possible influence over the next election cycle. The last thing progressives in the left need to do is divide and fracture the movement along class, race, religious, ethnic, or gender lines. And I know my guests on the show agree. I'm so grateful that they're here today to help in our struggle to imagine when justice is what love looks like in public, as we strive toward a moral fusion and policies based on transformative radical love, respect for all human and non-human species on the earth that sustains and has given us all life. So welcome, Susannah and Brian, to that to the radical imagination. Sorry for the long intro, but there's a lot to get out, and I'm so glad you're here, and welcome again to the radical imagination.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And as we discussed, we want to start off with each of your commitment and understanding and connection to Israel-Palestine. And take a few minutes and make this as personal as you want to. Our audience is interested in what you've come to believe and think and understand about both Israel and Palestine. Brian, should we start with you?
Sure. So you can cut me off when you want. So
Why
I'm
would
very
I do
pleased.
that? We're not going to cut you off.
Okay.
No, go
I'm
right
very well. Just give me guidelines in terms of time.
Do whatever you want.
I'm just really honored and delighted to be here, Jim. Thank you for organizing this. I'm really thrilled to be on this call with Susannah, who's a dear friend, someone I respect very highly, and for all her work. And I really look forward to the conversation. It's really a privilege to be involved with this conversation. So, Jim, you shared a lot of what Michelle Alexander shared about me in her article, and also beyond that, you told a lot of my story. I grew up in South Africa. I grew up in a very committed liberal Zionist family, and not only that, I really assimilated and believed in the Zionist dream as it was conveyed to me. I love the idea of the miracle of Israel after the Holocaust, providing a safe haven for Jews. I became a Zionist. I belonged to Habonim. I made Aliyah, immigrated to Israel as a young man right after high school, really feeling like there was no place for me in an apartheid society, and my role was to build an ideal Jewish society that would reflect the highest moral values of Judaism. Was taught to me by Zionism as the goal of Zionism itself, was to provide safety and a place for us to really act out our moral values and to be tested in terms of history, whether when Jews have power, would we treat those who are under our power, or would we use our power in a just way? And unfortunately, in terms of my life story, I maybe will go back to some of the instances along the way, but I became very involved in trying to build up that kind of Israel. I left Israel 2.5 years after I emigrated there, and then went back to South Africa, and then came to America. And from America, as a person studying to be a rabbi, and then as a rabbi, I've taken on this issue as critical. I've taken it on as critical because when as a child, I learned, first of all, that justice and justice for those who are oppressed was the central piece of my Judaism. It wasn't for naught that the Ten Commandments identifies God, the source of all being, as being the being who took us out of the land of slavery, and that God is, Yud-He Vav-He, is totally associated with justice for those who are oppressed. Not only that, I learned that Jewish experience, historical experience, taught us that. And so I made that a central part, that is a central part of my faith. It's a spiritual issue for me. And also my experience in South Africa, of course, attuned me to the incredible suffering that existed also in my own world and where I was privileged in South Africa. So that's a central spiritual issue for me. I then supported various Israeli human rights groups, Israelis committed against home demolition, Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel. And essentially from those people, I gained access to see with my own eyes atrocities that are done daily by the state of Israel that led me in 2008 to finally realize, after many, many years, that I could no longer identify as a Zionist. I could no longer identify as a Zionist because political Zionism, and I'm specifically saying political Zionism because there were other Zionisms like cultural Zionism before that and other forms of Zionism, but political Zionism had become a movement that implemented systemic discrimination on a daily basis on a people who had been dispossessed in the creation of the State of Israel. And in more recent years, I've realized, as you pointed out, that sadly, with great heartbreak, that in fact, it was in some ways inevitable. There was no way to create a Jewish state on a land inhabited by 1 million people without trying to move those 1 million people. And it's not incidental that Zionism, in fact, removed 3/4 of the inhabitants of Palestine from Palestine in 1947-48 either through overt acts of expulsion or through war or through their own fleeing through the conflict. And that just was too similar to me to South Africa. So it's with great heartbreak that I came to realize that. And I guess that's what Michelle Alexander highlighted in her piece, was to highlight the fact that I had gone through a change of heart. But I'm not alone. Many people have gone through that change of heart. Many people who haven't made a break with Zionism are going through being heartbroken by Israel as it develops into a more nationalist, racist country that is daily oppressing Palestinian people day by day and dispossessing them day by day. Okay. So that's, I guess, what I want to say, and that's my introduction.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. Susannah, would you like to comment on your own attachment in history and make any comments you want about what Brian just said?
Sure. So my experience in many ways is similar to Brian's, except that I grew up in the United States, in New York, in a very comfortable environment, but very conscious of the racism in America, which was pointed out to me by my father all the time. He became active in the civil rights movement and drew very strong connections between the experiences of poverty that he had in Poland and that African Americans were experiencing in the United States. And he also made it very clear that this was a form of systemic oppression. especially in America, that this was not some kind of accident, let's say, but that it was institutionalized. I was deeply moved by the way he and Dr. King and so many others used the Bible to make their point, and the way that the Bible and the prophets could speak to people, and that the hard hearts of America could be softened by invoking the prophets. So to be a Jew for me meant to be a prophetic Jew. It was prophetic Judaism. And so when I first went to Israel, what was most conscious to me was the history of my own family, the fact that my mother's family had come here, but my father's family, well, his mother was murdered, 3 of his sisters, his whole family was wiped out. And that was something that I knew about from the time I was very little. So Israel was presented to me, and I understood it as a kind of refuge for Jews, and really as a miracle. And I remember thinking as a child, it's incredible that a Jew can be a firefighter or make an army, and all of these things that I grew up thinking this is not possible. This is not a Jewish thing, because in America, all those things were done by Gentiles. So I was very proud of Israel. It was only much later when I went as a student by myself to Israel, to the university, that I suddenly started being attentive to what had been there all along. When I saw, for example, cars stopped at a roadblock, and it depended if you had an Israeli license plate or Palestinian. Was it yellow? Was it blue? And the Palestinians being stopped in the hot sun had to turn off their engines, stand outside their car, and wait for a very lengthy period of time. And I came home from that experience and so many other things that I observed. And I remember at Rosh Hashanah dinner that my father had since died, but I went with my mother to somebody's home where we had gone every year, and they asked me, how was your year in Israel? And I was very happy, etc. But I said, this is not a viable situation. This is just like in the South, this kind of a segregation. You can't treat people like this, and this can't continue. And a man at the table who was Israeli screamed at me, and he turned purple, and he was furious that I had said this. And honestly, I said it in all innocence. It seemed so obvious and clear to anybody. I couldn't imagine why he was angry. So it was my first experience of the hostility, the anger, the refusal to engage, the refusal to recognize, which was so obvious, from fellow Jews sitting at a table. So they were all angry at me. I will say that we continue to be invited every year for Rosh Hashanah, and after 3 or 4 years, this same man, who was always there every year, said to me, you were right. So I also recognize that all of us, Brian too, I suppose, and we would describe ourselves as having gone through a process of having our eyes open, let's say, of being sensitive to the reality of not going to Israel simply as a tourist or with a large Jewish group where you're kind of insulated from everything, but going as an individual and living in Israel gives you a very different picture.
Right.
And in that way, I say, on the one hand, it's devastating and depressing to see what Brian has just described. And on the other hand, I have a little bit of hope, because I do think that people can change, and they can, in fact, open their eyes, just like that man at Rosh Hashanah table opened his eyes. And I suppose that's what I hope, that open a few eyes if I can. I feel as though life is short. I have a little bit of time. What can I do? I'm not going to change things 180 degrees, but maybe 1 or 2 degrees. I can change a few minds, I would hope.
If I may, do you, Susannah, still identify, or do you identify in some way with political Zionism?
You know, I don't know what that means, frankly, these terms. I mean, people ask me, are you conservative, reform, orthodox? I don't know. I don't like the labels. Okay. So there were so many millions of different kinds of Zionisms from the beginning. It wasn't only Ahad Ha'am versus Herzl. There were all kinds of A.D. Gordon, all of these people. There's a Jabotinsky. And frankly, it also depends what period of time. You know, Robert Welch with binationalism was wonderful when he was in the 1920s, 1930s. Sure, I would have joined those people, those intellectuals, Gershom Scholem, Martin Buber.
Right.
But you know, by 1939, I probably would have been with Jabotinsky and said, yeah, give me a rifle. I want an army. So it depends on the moment.
Right.
So I don't think Jabotinsky is for this moment. I think the problem right now is that we're living in a moment and we have the wrong kind of Zionism dominating. It's not the Zionism we need right now. And people need to understand where we are historically and politically and culturally as Jews.
What is it that we need right now to bring the conversation forward? What is it we need to talk about? Was Michelle's article helpful? How helpful? In what ways was it perhaps added conflict?
Who you asked? What?
Brian, go ahead.
Well, I think what we need right now is exactly what Susannah just talked about. We need a prophetic Judaism. The problem is that Judaism got wedded completely with Zionism. For me, as I grew up, there was no space between Judaism and Zionism. And also in my experience as a rabbi, there's been no space between Judaism and Zionism. In fact, Zionism is the critical faith statement of most Jews today. As a rabbi, as a liberal rabbi, I could criticize anything about Jewish theology, history, ethics, whatever I would. People wouldn't bat an eye. It wouldn't upset them in any way. If I simply criticize the state of Israel in any way, all kinds of things like that dinner table that Susannah, you just described, will happen in the congregation. And I've experienced that. So we need a prophetic Judaism that is separated from Zionism. That is Judaism. That's a spiritual tradition not wedded to a nationalism, not wedded to a nation state. It may have relationship to that. For sure, I would want it to have relationship to it. The relationship I would want it to have is a relationship as a prophetic Judaism, trying to help that state to, as Susannah says, to open eyes and to choose another course, to change course, to do tshuva, to turn around. So that's what I think we need in our time. And I think that Michelle Alexander's piece was such a piece written not by a Jew. It was a prophetic statement. She made a prophetic statement, and she refused to be silent about something that she felt she needed to be silent about, because she, as a non-Jew, as non-Jews do, face all those pressures that I face as a Jew and a rabbi, and more. Right? They face the same pressures. There's enormous pressure that tries to silence people about this issue. All the debates about BDS, in fact, are attempts to silence people about this issue. Why is BDS portrayed as anti-Semitic? Why are all Palestinian advocates monitored and censored, and they, God forbid, say something out of line and they're brought up as anti-Semitic and so on? It's all a censoring done so as to silence, to promote the orthodoxy of Zionism and Judaism and the nexus between them. And we need to break that nexus, and we need to be able to, I think, develop a prophetic Judaism and a prophetic faith that transcends Judaism, that Michelle, in fact, spoke about, which is a prophetic religion that speaks truth to power, doesn't necessarily make the comfortable more comfortable, right? It's a prophetic Judaism that you know, Abram Joshua Heschel, Susannah's father, who was a tzaddik, Zichrono Livracha, taught us all about and exemplified in his life. So that's what I think we need at this moment.
Do you agree, Susannah?
I fully agree with Brian. I agree with him on all the points that he's just made, and I would just add to that, one of the things that I find disturbing is that there's an assumption that Zionism is a Jewish movement, that Israel is a Jewish state. But frankly, I think Zionism abandoned Judaism, and the state of Israel has abandoned Judaism. If these are the values, if this is the behavior, what happened to a sense of Jewish values and Jewish prophetic values? This is a distortion of Judaism, and a lot of scholars have actually written about this, how Judaism has been misconstrued, misused by what's developing now among the so-called leadership in Israel. And we also know that there are Israelis who join with us in this struggle and agree with us, and who are, in fact, putting themselves, their lives on the line. I think of David Schulman, for example, among others.
Women Wage Peace movement as well, correct?
Yes, but you
Right.
know, the problem is that it's gotten harder. The country, the politics in Israel have gotten harder and harsher over the years, as they have in this country too. I mean, look what we're doing. And I also ask myself how much of it is coming. You know, people say that there was that ad, and or rather the cartoon in the New York Times, International New York Times recently, that showed Trump as a dog on a leash being led by Netanyahu. Remember that? So
Yes.
it was as obnoxious in some ways. Okay.
And taken down immediately, but still.
Right, but the point is
made.
that people,
Right.
there are people who make the argument that Israel is in charge of American politics. It's a problematic trope. Jews are running the world. I don't like that trope. I actually think that that Israel is very much running at the behest of the United States in certain ways.
Agreed.
We as a country, we Americans, we have our military equipment and our bases, et cetera, located there. We use Israel also as a tool to give a kind of welfare system to the arms dealers and arms makers in this country. We give foreign aid to Israel so that Israel can then turn around and buy jet planes and bombers, et cetera, from us, which keeps our companies going and gives jobs to our workers. So there is a relationship there that's very complicated. Israel doesn't stand by itself.
Right. So the progressive movement, do you worry about further fracturing along racial or ethnic lines, as I mentioned in the introduction? Do you see that happening? Are you worried about that?
I think it's fracturing along political lines. And what bothers me is, for example, when Black Lives Matter 3 years ago came out with a platform, it was a very, very, very long platform that had one paragraph about Israel supporting BDS. And all the Jewish organizations said, we're never going to talk to Black Lives Matter. That's it. Well, no. You know, I'm a teacher. What do? I sit and talk to people. I discuss. I want to hear their viewpoints.
Right.
Whom should I talk to? Only with the people who agree with me? Black Lives Matter, that's exactly the people we should be talking to. If you don't agree with someone, talk to them. And the problem right now is that we only talk to the people who agree, but everybody knows this already. Now, who's going to do the hard work of sitting down and talking to people who completely disagree, whose positions are anathema to us?
Right.
That's not so easy. And they often don't want to sit down with us. And they persecute people like Brian.
Right. And Brian, can you give us some insight in terms of some of your own experiences in South Africa and attempts, Truth and Reconciliation committees? How did that work? Is that possible at this time in Israel, Palestine? Are we ready for that?
Well,
or
the Truth and
needing
Reconciliation Commission, it would be a wonderful day when there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States or in Israel. Either place. But you only get to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission once you have had a transformation of an unjust, oppressive society. It's only once a movement that is working for the prophetic goals of justice, freedom, and equality has achieved something of that, or maybe a large part of it, but usually they don't achieve everything. They move the needle towards justice, freedom, and equality. And unless there's a significant moving of that needle towards justice, freedom, and equality, you don't really get a Truth and Justice Commission, because a Truth and Justice Commission is part of that transformation. Secondly, I want to say it's a fraught question. My own daughter arrived back from 6 months in South Africa just last night. And I had this conversation with her this morning in the car about the Truth and Justice, about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There are many, many diverse feelings in South Africa about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it didn't demand that people who had committed atrocities of the highest order that would just make your blood boil. You would just be devastated by hearing the cruelty of it. And they weren't held. They could come together, and then somehow their victims were encouraged to forgive them. And some of the victims said, there's no way I'm forgiving them. I'm not going to forgive them until they take accountability, true accountability for what they did. They're not going to just stand up here and say, okay, this is what I did. They need to say, I'm really sorry for what I did, and they need to do some reparation. There needs to be some way in which my grievance, my hurt is repaired. And so, so it's a complicated question. I don't want to say it's an easy question. On the other hand, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? And I think that's what motivated Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu to believe that somehow, even though this did not involve restitution in any way, even though people who had committed horrendous crimes to multiple people were just let off for acknowledging that they did it, and now today they may be rich white South Africans living in the suburbs, living the life much like they lived pre-apartheid, whereas the black citizens that they oppressed are still living as poor people in a society that's incredibly unequal. So there are mixed feelings about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So
it hasn't transformed the society to the extent that it needed to, is what you're saying, correct?
It hasn't held accountable the people that needed to be held accountable. I mean, it's the same issue as South Africa when it went through its transformation. It went through a transformation that involved political equality, more political equality, but not economic equality. And so in South Africa today, black citizens, for the most part, are in the same situation they were under apartheid, and most whites are in the same privileged situation they were under apartheid. South Africa is not going to really see a vibrant future without grappling with that question.
Susannah, I see you smiling and nodding, so get in here on this.
Yes, I want to say I fully agree with Brian. I actually was in Cape Town twice at the university, once in 1996 and once in 2012. And I found in 1996, when the Truth and Reconciliation was still happening, there were plenty of people who were just completely oblivious to it, plenty of white people. They just weren't watching and so on. They didn't take an interest. It was not like, let's say, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, when everybody was glued, everybody in that country. So something, and then of course it's politicized. But when I was there in 2012, as it happened one Friday morning, there was a front page article about a strike of black workers of a mine. And the police had opened fire and massacred a whole bunch of them. I don't remember the exact number. That night I went to a local synagogue for the service, Friday night service. And the chief rabbi of South Africa came to give the sermon that night, just by chance. And he spoke about everything, but he didn't mention what had just happened. The front page, big news that the police opened fire on people who were legally, legitimately standing peacefully on a strike.
Not one word.
And I asked him afterwards, Yeah, I asked him, why didn't you mention this? Why don't you say this?
What did he say?
Oh, he brushed me off. No, he turned away. He wasn't interested. He wouldn't even give me an answer. I think the Jews of South Africa that I met, and that's just one occasion, one moment, let's say, but if they're not engaged and they don't care about a massacre that's just happened, they're living in their own bubble. They are living in South Africa, but they are not part of South Africa, of the country, of the culture, of the promise, of the future, of the hope. That's not how one can live. Now, I think in Israel what's going on is somewhat different, somewhat the same. That is, you don't make peace by having two leaders sign a treaty. There has to be a cultural revolution. The country has to want peace and has to embrace it. It has to embrace peace with Palestinians. And that means a great deal. It means, in fact, truth, as well as reconciliation. And they haven't gotten there. And I see just what happened this past few days in Berlin when the director of the Jewish Museum had to resign. He was attacked, among other things, for an exhibit on Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem. Why? Because he mentioned that not only Jews, but Christians and Muslims also long for Jerusalem. Well, that's true, but the Israeli embassy was furious. Why? Truth. If we can't have truth, we're lost politically.
Do you feel there are... Oh, go ahead, Brian, go ahead.
No, I wonder, Susannah, I mean, one of the things I wrestle with a lot is this sort of mythology that every nation state has, right? And the mythology that we were taught about the nation state of Israel, which of course has as many lies in its story as the mythology of the United States of America, or the mythology I was taught about the history of South Africa. And the question for Jews is, are we going to be able to face the truth about the founding of Israel, given what you said, and which I agree with, I totally agree with, for me as well as a child, and even now I see the founding of Israel as a miracle for those folk, Jews, who were massacred in Europe, and the refugees, those who survived afterwards, to go and live in a Jewish space that would provide them with safety and security. That does seem like something that's profoundly moving and on the level of thinking of it as miraculous. And yet I know that that miracle, if it was a miracle, is the reality is that the story I was told and that you were undoubtedly told as a child is simply a pack of lies. Now, I actually heard that story directly from Ben-Gurion in 1969 as a madrich, as a counselor in Habonim, where he emphatically argued to a challenge from a left-wing Zionist madrich, a counselor from HaShomer HaTzair, about what happened in 1948. And he went through all the sort of basic propaganda about that, which was that no Palestinian was expelled. We offered to ensure that they can stay in their houses, that they would be protected by the state. No one was thrown out. And in fact, what happened was Arab propagandists offered them 2 houses if they went out and fought for the ending of the Zionist movement up till that point. So all of that is historically totally inaccurate. It's just totally, it's lies. It's not true. It's not a true story. But then nation states don't usually tell true stories about their birth. But it means for Jews the acknowledgement that what was a project that in part, not in whole, because Zionism started way before the Holocaust, it wasn't only directed to the Holocaust, but it is a project that came out of the violence of Christian anti-Semitism for Jews in Europe. And so that for us to face the truth that Jewish state was created based on the dispossession of another people is something that's really at the heart of the truth that Jews are going to have to grapple with, are going to have to acknowledge one way or another if we're going to go forward.
Go ahead, Susannah. How should we grapple
Yes.
with it in terms of
I
the state?
agree with you, and that's why scholarship is very important, because politicians do lie and create myths and seek to exculpate themselves, as Ben-Gurion did. I agree with you. And so I'm grateful, for example, to Benny Morris for the work he did on 1948, the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem, where he pointed out that some Palestinians left their homes because they were fleeing war and scared. And some were told by advancing Arab armies, get out of the way, and some were expelled by Jewish forces, Israeli forces, told them to get out. But the real issue isn't even the expulsion as much as it is the refusal of the Israeli government at the end of the war to allow the Palestinians to return to their homes.
Right.
That's really the even bigger problem and scandal. And what do we do with that? And I have to say the problem today to me seems, though, of course, it's even worse, one might say. That is, when we talk this way, we are thinking in our minds about human rights, about the rule of law, of what's acceptable and not acceptable. We think about principles of justice, for example, and what a state has to do. It's the responsibility of a state toward its citizens and toward the acts that it has done in the past and in the present and the future, et cetera, et cetera. And my concern right now is that there are a growing number of Israelis who couldn't care less about the state. What they want is the land.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of anarchy developing. The state, they're not interested. If anything, they want to demolish institutions like the courts, like the Supreme Court. Get rid of it. Let's just have the land. And let's turn to religious leadership, for example. And that's a kind of anarchy that takes us even beyond what we could have imagined in our worst, most depressing moments.
Right.
Even more traumatized population on both sides, correct? Are there
Yes,
enough?
I have to say,
Go
I
ahead.
feel sometimes as though the whole world has been drinking poison water, and it's a kind of virus, because I see this kind of rejection of the state around the world, including in this country. Don't you think? Look how Trump has destroyed the State Department and abandoned diplomacy. Don't you think his people want to get rid of a Supreme Court altogether? Institutions of the state, they don't want to finance anything. Yeah, no taxes, no fire department, no schools. Let them all be privatized. The prisons, the concentration camps that are being run right now for people seeking asylum, that are for-profit companies.
Yeah.
Where's the state? There is no more state.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Actually, we're taping this on the same day that Reverend William Barber is and others, Poor People's Campaign, are testifying before Congress to try to develop that narrative, which we haven't had in so many decades, listening to the least of us and the voice and their own experiences, their own narrative. That's part of what Radical Love is teaching us and what we need to do. Is that
Right.
Is that something that, obviously we need to do that in this country. Are there forces in Israel, Palestine that are trying to do the same?
Well,
Some
I
sort
don't
of
know.
tikkun reconciliation.
Right. I mean, personally, I feel an obligation as a Jew to support the demand of the oppressed for justice, equality, and freedom. That's a basic demand. That's a basic demand that I think God makes of human beings to support, and definitely what I think God demands of Jews to support is justice, freedom, and equality. Each human being is created in the image of God. If, Michelle Alexander, yes, quotes William Barber as saying, Palestinian child is a child of God. That's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. And that child of God is entitled to the same treatment as another child of God who happens to be Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Rwandan or whatever. All children of God are entitled to justice. And there is a movement. I mean, the irony here is there is a movement that Palestinians created that was a nonviolent movement, right? That is a nonviolent movement that calls for pressure to be brought on the state of Israel to change its ways and to do tshuva. And somehow Israel government, evangelical Christians, I'm not sure of all the players, Jewish organizations, have decided to brand that movement as the central issue and to brand it as anti-Semitism and to make anti-Semitism the focus, that anti-Semitism is the problem here. The problem here is oppression and inequality. It is true that there's anti-Semitism too, and it is a problem, but the primary problem here is oppression of Palestinians. And that's what we need to have as religious people in front of us. That needs to be what guides us. So that I find, for me, I support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement because I think it's a movement run by the oppressed, calling for freedom and equality. That's what it's basically about, and calling for it with nonviolence. Now, I don't, but I could disagree with one of its goals or another. For instance, many Jews will say that the call for the return of refugees is a code for the destruction of Israel, and it's not viable, whatever. But even then, right, first of all, I think, as Susannah said, those refugees have the right to return. Whether it's possible for them to return will be worked out, but it's definitely possible for large numbers of Palestinians who were expelled from Israel to return to Israel without anything bad happening to Jews in Israel, without them losing their homes. It's not about coming back to homes that are now inhabited by Israelis, and they have the right to return. So I think of my bar mitzvah. At my bar mitzvah in South Africa, I received many, many certificates of trees that were planted in Israel to reclaim the lands, quote unquote. Later in my life, I've learned that those trees, like most other trees of the JNF that were raised, were planted on the ruins of a village by the name of Lubia. Lubia was a village where people left or were expelled. And after the war, the village was demolished to the ground, just demolished. And on top of it, a forest was planted with money that was given to me for my bar mitzvah. That needs to be redressed, that needs to be addressed, and there needs to be redress for that. We need to have in mind that those people, Palestinians, have the right to equality, freedom, and justice. And Jews, somehow many Jews, have framed, I only realized this so intensely this past week as a result of an interfaith dialogue I did in Ithaca, New York last week, that in some ways Jews have from the outset misunderstood Palestinian resistance to Zionism as anti-Semitism, basically seeing Palestinian resistance to the creation of the State of Israel as a form of anti-Semitism. Now, in fact, Zionism, as I said earlier, was propelled by Christian anti-Semitism. Christian anti-Semitism made it impossible for Jews to live in Europe in safety. And so Jews wanted to get out, quite understandably, and find a safe space, but not at the expense of another people, and then calling those other people anti-Semitic for not agreeing to their own displacement and dispossession. So the racist notion that this was a land without a people for a people without a land, and that's exactly what it is. It's a racist colonial notion, because any sane human being would understand that on that land, just as on the land of all the land in Africa, there were people who were living there, and they were real people, children of God, as William Barber points out, that, you know, those people have the right to be where they are. And so that's what we need to, I believe that's where I go with my, that's what I support in the world. That's what I support in the world. And I support proud and incredibly brave and courageous Israelis, of which there are only a small group of people left in Israel who uphold that, but I treasure each and every one of them. And I'll do anything to help their work. I'll do anything to help their work, because I think it needs to be a joint project. Ultimately, the oppressed need to fight for their freedom, and we need to support that. But ultimately, it will only end up in a good way if, in fact, Israeli society, Jewish society, is able to do tshuva, is able to repent or reckon or take accountability, be accountable for what happened.
Thank you, Brian. Listen, we have 1 minute to go, so I want to give Susannah the last word on this. It's ironic that we started this show, Nina Simone, singing of the land of milk and honey. So, Susannah, in the last minute or so, give us your vision here of what could happen, what should happen.
So I appreciate everything Brian has said. I would just, there's a lot more. Of course, we could continue the conversation for a long time. I think American Jews also have a responsibility and play a very significant role. I know that in the United States, there is a sense of horror among a lot of Jews, really a sizable number, about the policies of the State of Israel. And they want to see a major change. And it's one of the reasons that the current Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, has turned to the evangelical Christian community for support. They support him, I think, with more enthusiasm than American Jews do, most American Jews. So what can we do then in this situation? It puts us in a very difficult bind, but we do try to talk, to explain, to have conversation. I think it's important for us to, first of all, bolster the notion of a state, and a state has responsibilities to care for its citizens, and we can't let the state be rejected in favor of some kind of anarchy. We also have to understand that what Brian said, anti-Semitism was a reason for Zionism, but not now. Now we have Jewish values that have to be recovered, and Zionism has to represent prophetic Judaism, or it's lost all viability.
Absolutely. And on that note, we're going to have to let it, we have to leave. Thank you so much. This has been a terrific conversation. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. And we're going to go out with Joan Baez singing Forever Young. Thank you so much. This is Jim Vrettos for The Radical Imagination. See you all next week. Thank you.
May God bless and keep you always. May your wishes all come true. May you always do for others and let others do for you. May you build a ladder to the stars and climb on every rung, and may you stay